This is how the birth of Jesus Christ came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be with child through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was a righteous man and did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly.
A Jewish pledge to be married implied a much stronger tie than our Western concept of engagement. In almost every sense, the couple was considered married. Joseph was called Mary's husband and vice versa. The only difference was they had not lived together nor had sexual union. According to the customs of that day, to break the engagement, a divorce was required. Now, you can just imagine how Joseph felt. He must have been in a sweat. Mary was pregnant, and the child was not his. To reveal the truth publicly would label Mary for what she must be, an adulteress, unless Mary's preposterous explanation about an angel appearing to her was right. Nah, that was absurd. The poor girl must be losing her mind. Joseph loved her, but he could not marry a girl who had cheated on him and then was obviously trying to cover it up with an insane story. Well, what Joseph thought about it, we really don't know, but we do know that he painfully decided to divorce her quietly.
But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins."
All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us.
Joseph could not have heard it more plainly. Mary was a virgin, but she was going to have a child. The child's name would be Jesus, which means deliverer or savior. He would deliver or save people from the consequences of their sin. Another of Jesus' names would be Emmanuel, meaning God with us. God with us. Jesus would be God living in human flesh among men. The prophet Isaiah had written about this event 700 years before.
Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel.
Joseph must have bolted upright in bed. So Isaiah had been right. It was happening just as God said it would. But what would everyone think? No matter. There was only one thing to do. He would believe God.
When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife. But he had no union with her until she gave birth to a son. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world.
Caesar needed money, and if the Romans got an accurate census, more people would have to pay taxes. It is doubtful that Joseph was very happy. His wife was almost due. Being a carpenter by trade, he'd probably been working on a crib and arranged with a local midwife for a clean, safe place for the baby's delivery. Now, because of the census, he was required to take his wife to Bethlehem, which 1,000 years before had been King David's ancestral home. A 70-mile or 120-kilometer trip with a wife who might give birth any day was not a welcome thought when you had to travel on donkey or on foot. Why did the Romans have to come up with this idea now anyway? Why not take the census in Joseph's hometown, Nazareth? This was very awkward. Joseph's careful plans were shattered. But the Romans weren't giving people any choice, so he'd have to take Mary to Bethlehem.
And everyone went to his own town to register.
So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn.
So Jesus was born in Bethlehem, far from Joseph and Mary's hometown. Bethlehem was so crowded that the only place where they could find lodging was in a stable. Jesus' first crib was a manger, a trough for feeding cattle. As Joseph looked at his wife, it must have seemed like his painstaking plans had all gone wrong. Bethlehem, of all places, and in a musty stable. But as he looked at the child, Joseph must have sensed that everything was right, very much right.
And he gave him the name Jesus.
And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified.
But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. Today, in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is Christ the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger."
Suddenly a great company of the heavenly host appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to men on whom his favor rests."
The shepherds had been minding their own business, tending their sheep as they always had. Often sheep from their flocks were used in the temple sacrifices in Jerusalem, only a few miles north of Bethlehem. Life continued as usual. But now the angels had come, and their whole world was askew. The shepherds must have excitedly queried each other, "Did you hear what I heard? The Christ is the Lord." Now, we need to understand something about this word Christ. The Greek word Christ is the same as the Hebrew word Messiah. Both words mean anointed one. For centuries upon centuries, the name Messiah had applied to the promised deliverer. Now the angels were saying that the anointed one, the Messiah, the Christ, he was the Lord. He was God himself.
When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about."
So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby who was lying in the manger. When they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child.
The shepherds were poor men, not the sort of folks that one would normally expect to be invited to the birth of a king. But there were others on their way to see Jesus.
After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him."
The Magi were men of status and wealth. Christmas scenes depict 3 Magi, but the Bible does not say how many there actually were. The Magi were probably non-Jewish religious astrologers coming from Arabia or further east. Such men could be expected to visit a king. The king enthroned in Judea at this time was Herod the Great, who no doubt had been alerted to this rather prestigious company. They could hardly have escaped the notice of the sentries guarding Judea's borders. Their visit could not have been perceived as a threat, as they were not leading armies. All they had was a question: where is the newborn king?
When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him.
That single question really rocked Herod. He held his authority as a king in tightly clenched fists, and he would crush anyone who would dare try to wrench it from him. The whole city must have been shaken as well. Herod was known to be cruel to his citizens, especially when he was upset. Now, let me give you an example of just how that worked itself out. This reputation for cruelty was so common, he was so hated, that Herod knew that when he died, no one would mourn his passing. He knew that most likely spontaneous celebration would break out. So when Herod was close to death, he commanded notable men from all parts of the nation to assemble in Jerusalem. The Jewish historian Josephus said there was a great multitude that came. If they did not come, they were under orders to be put to death. Now, Herod had these men locked inside the hippodrome, which is like a stadium, and he instructed that on his death, these men were to be murdered. By giving this last command, he ensured that there would not only be mourning, but there would be national mourning on the day that he died. Well, this order was never carried out, but it does show the frame of mind that this man had. So when Herod was questioned about the birth of another king, no one knew what he might do. Well, Herod called in his religious advisors.
When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born.
You can see an agitated scribe blowing the dust off a small scroll. His fellow sages bend over the papyrus and with rheumy eyes scan the text. They're a little rattled. They want Herod to understand it was not them who said these things. A prophet by the name of Micah had written it over 700 years earlier. A shaky finger points to a well-worn part of the document. Herod disdains to look. A scribe clears his raspy throat and reads,
"But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from of old, from everlasting."
The prophet clearly said that the one to be born had lived from everlasting. Herod must have been ashen. It couldn't be. Only God was eternal. God would never come to earth as an infant, especially to be born in the backwoods of Bethlehem. He would arrive with trumpets and chariots in Jerusalem. Perhaps the scribes were intentionally trying to alarm him, to manipulate him. It wouldn't hurt to humor them. He would show them what sort of worship new kings could expect. He'd shoot out the priests.
Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him."
After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and of incense and of myrrh.
These men of wealth and status worshiped Jesus. The law was very specific. Only the God Most High was to be worshiped. Joseph and Mary knew the Ten Commandments well, and yet they did not intervene. They must have known deep down inside that the Magi were worshiping God, God who had come in human flesh.
And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route.
When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said. "Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him."
So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod.
Consistent with what secular history records of him, Herod did make an all-out effort to kill Jesus, but the child remained safe in Egypt. Eventually, Herod died, and so Joseph, Mary, and Jesus moved back to Nazareth, where Joseph worked as a carpenter.
And the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him.
Well, the events surrounding Jesus' birth began and ended right here in Nazareth. Bethlehem was Jesus' birthplace, but it was in Nazareth that Jesus grew to be an adult. The modern-day city of Nazareth is quite a large metropolis now, perched on the top of some very steep cliffs. But back in Jesus' day, it was a small town in this region of Galilee. It was in this area that Jesus spent his boyhood. Before we leave Jesus' childhood, we're going to look at one more story, something that happened to him when he was 12 years of age.